There are moments when the whole world seems to hold its breath. That morning, in the small Ohio town of Ashbury, a relentless rain battered the streets, turning the gutters into tiny rivers and soaking the fields beyond the cemetery gates. Umbrellas bloomed in black clusters, heads bowed as people gathered under the old sycamore trees to mourn Officer David Miller, a man who'd given everything to his badge, his family, and his town. But the true storm was not in the sky. It was in the hearts of those who had come to say goodbye, and especially in the restless, anxious pacing of Rex, the German Shepherd K9 who'd been David's loyal partner for 6 years. Rex was more than a police dog. He was David's shadow, his protector, his confidant on night patrols and early morning call-outs, the four-legged member of a team that was now broken forever. The air crackled with tension as the funeral procession arrived, black sedans crawling through puddles, headlights glinting off the rain-slicked stones. Detective Julia Saunders, David's partner and closest friend, stood stiffly beside Margaret Miller, David's mother, whose red-rimmed eyes never left the casket. Even under the shelter of the funeral tent, the air felt damp and cold, as if the sky itself was grieving. At the edge of the crowd, Rex strained at his leash, every muscle tense, tail down, head lowered. His whines were sharp, insistent, an ache that echoed in the hearts of the officers who'd served with him. Julia knelt down, tried to calm him with a gentle hand and a whisper. "Easy, boy. I know. But Rex would not be soothed. As the pallbearers lifted the casket, the flag draped in perfect, heartbreaking folds, Rex let out a low, mournful howl. The sound cut through the rain and the prayers, drawing anxious glances and nervous whispers from the gathered mourners. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others reached for tissues, wiping at tears that wouldn't stop. Father O'Malley began to speak, voice trembling just slightly as he recalled David's years of service, his kindness, his bravery. But Julia couldn't focus on the words. Her eyes kept darting to Rex, whose agitation seemed to grow with every minute. The dog's chest heaved. His claws scrabbled at the wet grass. It wasn't just grief. There was something urgent, something desperate in his manner. The moment the casket passed by, Rex lunged forward, catching Julia off guard. The leash jerked out of her hand. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Rex bounded up the aisle, barking, loud, sharp, a warning. Several officers moved to intercept, but Julia shouted, "Wait, he's not dangerous!" Even as she ran after him, her gut twisted with dread. Rex circled the casket, nose working furiously, then pressed his paw against the wood, whimpering. Margaret Miller froze, one hand clutching her heart, while the funeral director moved forward, alarmed. "Ma'am, should I?" But Julia raised a hand. "Give him a second." She remembered David's stories about Rex, how he could sniff out danger in a crowd, or find a missing child in a blizzard. He'd saved lives with that nose. What was he trying to tell them now? The rain seemed to intensify, drumming on the canvas above as Rex began to claw at a specific spot on the casket, frantic now, barking louder. The whispers became panicked, the line between grief and fear suddenly thin as a razor. Julia stepped closer, heart pounding. "Rex! What's wrong? What is it, boy?" She knelt beside him, laying a hand on the smooth, rain-spattered wood. Rex's eyes met hers, wide, pleading. For a split second, Julia thought she heard a faint sound, a muffled whimper, almost too soft to be real, lost in the patter of rain and sobs. Father O'Malley hesitated, then signaled for the funeral director to open the casket. The crowd recoiled, uncertain, but something in Julia's voice, Something in Rex's urgency gave everyone pause. The lid was carefully lifted, and there, nestled beneath David's old patrol jacket, was a bundled, shivering mass of golden fur. A puppy. A golden retriever, barely alive, eyes half closed, breath coming in tiny, ragged puffs. Someone gasped. Margaret stumbled backward, covering her mouth, while Julia scooped up the puppy, feeling its thin ribs and damp fur, a red-stained bandage on one leg. Oh my God. Rex nudged Julia's arm, insistent, as if urging her to act. The crowd was stunned, unsure whether to cry or call for help. Julia looked at Margaret, whose confusion and shock had been replaced by a strange, wild hope. Did he? Julia shook her head. I don't know, but I promise we'll figure this out. Above them, thunder rolled again, rattling the tent, as if the storm was only beginning. The rain had not let up. Even as the crowd dispersed from the cemetery, shock still lingered in the air like static. Umbrellas closed and cars rolled away, their tires splashing through puddles, but Julia Saunders remained behind with Rex and the tiny, battered puppy clutched in her arms. Margaret Miller, her face pale with confusion and wonder, hovered close. Why was the puppy? Margaret's voice cracked, and she shook her head, unable to finish. The funeral director and Father O'Malley stood awkwardly nearby, exchanging glances, unsure whether this was a miracle, a message, or a mistake. Julia crouched beneath the tent, examining the puppy. She's so cold and hurt. She noticed the raw patch on the puppy's leg, the trembling that shook her tiny body, and the odd shape of the bundle. A blue handkerchief with David's initials tied carefully as a sling. Julia's hands trembled as she pressed her palm to the pup's chest, feeling for a heartbeat. It was weak, but steady. Rex pressed close, his nose bumping the puppy, tail wagging in anxious little bursts. The loyalty and protectiveness in his gaze was unmistakable. He had risked everything, even disrupting the funeral, to make sure this little life was not left behind. Margaret steadied herself on a folding chair, eyes glistening. Why would David hide a puppy? In his casket? Julia shook her head. I don't know, but he must have known she was in trouble. And Rex wouldn't let her go. She met the German shepherd's eyes. You did good, buddy. A paramedic from the honor guard, Officer Garcia, knelt beside Julia, pulling out a small first aid kit from his coat. Let me take a look. She's breathing, that's a good sign. He gently wrapped a blanket around the puppy. She'll need warmth and a vet, fast. Margaret reached out, her hand trembling as she stroked the puppy's soft, golden head. We can't just leave her. Julia nodded. We won't. In the back of her mind, questions were forming. Why was David's old jacket the puppy's blanket? Why did he have a puppy with him at all, especially one so injured? Julia tried to recall their last conversation. David had been tired, distracted, but wouldn't say why. She remembered thinking he was hiding something, but not like this. The rain softened to a drizzle as the group packed up the last of the funeral arrangements. Julia, Margaret, Rex, and the puppy, now wrapped snugly in David's handkerchief, walked quietly to Julia's car. The puppy whimpered but did not cry out, resting her head on Julia's shoulder, as if she knew she was finally safe. As they drove, Margaret was silent, her hands folded in her lap. Rex watched the puppy intently from the back seat, refusing to relax. It was as if he was guarding her with his life. Julia's phone buzzed with a message from the station, but she ignored it. There would be time for paperwork and condolences later. Right now, there was only this fragile, inexplicable mystery. They arrived at Julia's house just as thunder rumbled again in the distance. Julia unlocked the door and ushered everyone inside, flicking on lights and turning up the heat. "Let's get her warm," she said, laying the puppy on a pile of old towels by the fireplace. Rex curled around her protectively, never more than a foot away. Julia rummaged through her kitchen for milk, soft bread, anything the puppy might be able to eat. She soaked bread in warm milk and offered it gently. The puppy licked it up, slow and cautious, then lay her head back down. "That's good," Julia murmured. "Just a little at a time." Margaret hovered nearby, hands wringing. "Do you think, she'll make it?" "I don't know," Julia admitted, "but I'm going to try. And I'll call Alan Reynolds. He's the best vet in town. He'll come, even late." The storm lashed at the windows, wind howling through the trees, but inside, a strange calm settled. Julia found herself thinking back to all those late nights on patrol with David, sharing coffee and secrets while Rex napped in the back seat. David had always loved animals. He once pulled over to rescue a turtle in the middle of a highway, insisting, "If you can save a life, you have to try." She wondered now if David had left a clue for her, or if this puppy was simply the last good deed of a man who always tried to do the right thing. But the oddness of it, Rex's agitation, the hidden bundle, the blood-stained bandage, felt too deliberate, too pointed to be random. Julia turned to Margaret. "Do you know anything about a puppy? Did David mention—" Margaret shook her head. "No. He was quiet these last few weeks. Kept saying he had to finish something. I thought it was work." She wiped her eyes. Maybe it was. As the clock ticked toward midnight, Julia called Dr. Reynolds, apologizing for the late hour. "It's urgent, Alan. There's a puppy. She's hurt." The vet's voice was kind and alert. "I'll be there in 15 minutes. Keep her warm." Julia returned to the fireplace, where Rex stood guard, never blinking. She realized then just how deep his bond with David ran, and how determined he was to protect what little was left of his partner's legacy. The puppy whimpered and shifted, one paw reaching out, tiny claws brushing Rex's fur. Rex lay down beside her, his tail thumping gently. Julia watched as, for the first time since the funeral, something like hope flickered in Margaret's eyes. Outside, the rain began to ease, but Julia knew the real storm. The questions, the danger, the secrets David had left behind, was only just beginning. She whispered to the puppy, whose gold fur glimmered in the firelight, "You're safe now. Whatever David was trying to tell us, we'll figure it out." Rex's ears twitched, and for a moment, Julia imagined David himself might be watching, trusting her, trusting them all, to finish what he had started. Thunder rattled the window panes as Julia Saunders locked her front door, heart still pounding from the strange events at the cemetery. The puppy, now named Hope, for that was what Margaret whispered when she first stroked the pup's trembling head, rested in a nest of towels near the hearth. Rex lay beside her, broad chest rising and falling, ears always alert. Julia moved through her small house, switching on every lamp as if light alone could keep the gathering storm at bay. The house was old, the kind that creaked and groaned in bad weather, but tonight it felt almost like a sanctuary, set apart from the world by walls and the heavy downpour outside. Still, the odd tension lingered in every corner. She filled a bowl with water and set it near Hope, who sniffed but was too exhausted to drink. Hope's wounded leg looked worse in the bright light, a clumsy, blood-stained bandage possibly wrapped in haste. Julia's gut twisted at the thought that David, already sick or grieving, must have done his best to save her. But how had the puppy ended up in his casket? And why had Rex reacted as if the world itself was ending? Margaret moved silently around the kitchen, making tea she barely sipped. Every now and then, her gaze drifted to Hope and Rex, as if afraid both might disappear. "He was always bringing home strays," Margaret murmured at last, voice shaky. "Cats, dogs, even a crow once. But this is different." Julia nodded. "It is. There's something he wanted us to find, or protect." Her phone vibrated with another message from the police station, but she didn't answer. She felt cut off from her old world, as if she, Rex, Hope, and Margaret were the only souls left on Earth, huddled together against the storm. The clock in the hallway ticked toward 10 as the wind howled louder. Rex lifted his head, growled low, then settled again. Hope shifted closer to him, letting out a sigh so soft Julia wondered if she'd imagined it. A sudden flash of headlights outside made Julia jump. She hurried to the window and peered through the rain. Relief washed over her as she recognized Dr. Alan Reynolds's battered old pickup pulling into her driveway. He was a big man in his 60s, practical and calm, the sort of person who never rushed, but always arrived exactly when you needed him. She opened the door before he could knock. "Alan, thank you for coming." He brushed water from his hat, eyes taking in the scene quickly. Rex, on high alert. Margaret, pale and anxious. Hope, a golden smudge in the firelight. "Let's see our little patient," he said softly. Kneeling by Hope, Alan worked with the practiced calm of a man who'd seen every kind of injury. "She's lucky someone found her," he murmured. He examined the makeshift bandage, clucked his tongue and gently unwrapped it. Margaret gasped at the sight. An ugly gash, scabbed and angry but not infected. "Whoever did this tried to help," Alan said, glancing at Julia, "but it was done in a hurry." He cleaned the wound, applied antiseptic, and rewrapped the leg with practiced hands. "She's dehydrated, underfed, but tough. Give her small amounts of water and food. If she makes it through tonight, she'll make it." Hope licked his fingers, then curled back against Rex, who licked her ear in return. Julia felt her own breath ease. For the first time since the funeral, it seemed possible that things might be all right. Alan straightened, glancing between Julia and Margaret. What happened exactly? Julia recounted the day's events. The funeral, Rex's strange behavior, the discovery of Hope, and the feeling that none of it was random. Alan listened without interruption, then sighed. David was a good man. If he hid this puppy, he was trying to protect her from something, or someone. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. But who would want to hurt a puppy? Why? No one had an answer. The wind shook the house again, and all three adults looked toward the window, as if expecting someone, or something, to appear out of the storm. Julia saw Rex bristle, eyes fixed on the front door. The dog's body was tense, ready. Julia stepped closer to the door, peering out, but there was nothing, only the reflection of rain on the driveway and the hiss of tires in the distance. "Maybe you should stay here tonight," Alan suggested quietly. "All of you. I don't like the feeling around this." Julia nodded. "I was thinking the same thing." She locked the doors, checked the windows, and pulled the curtains tight. Hope needed protection. They all did. As the night wore on, Julia made up beds for Margaret and Alan in the guest room. She herself would sleep on the couch, as close to Rex and Hope as possible. But sleep didn't come easily. The house groaned. The storm raged. Shadows danced in the firelight. Lying awake, Julia thought of David, his stubborn kindness, the way he always went the extra mile, and the heaviness in his eyes those last few weeks. Had he known he was in danger? Had he tried to leave them a message? At midnight, Rex left Hope's side and paced the house, nose twitching, claws clicking on the hardwood. Julia followed him, flashlight in hand, her nerves frayed. Every creak made her jump. At one point, she was sure she saw movement in the yard, a flash of something, maybe a person, maybe just a tree swaying in the wind. She pressed her palm to the window, feeling the cold glass, and whispered into the darkness. "What were you trying to tell me, David?" In the living room, Hope whimpered softly. Margaret knelt beside her, whispering soothing words. Alan dozed in a chair, arms crossed, his face worried even in sleep. Finally, as the storm's fury began to fade and the first light of dawn crept across the sky, Julia let herself close her eyes. Rex settled next to her, chin on his paws, keeping watch even as the world outside grew quiet. Inside Julia's house, a fragile peace reigned. But Julia knew, deep down, that the real danger, the reason for David's final, desperate act, was still out there, somewhere in the dark. Night in Ashbury was never truly silent. Even after the storm had passed, the house seemed to shudder with every gust of wind, old timbers creaking, water dripping from the gutters in steady, lonely rhythms. Julia Saunders sat curled in the living room armchair, the fire burning low. On the rug, Rex rested with his chin on his front paws, body coiled but eyes bright and attentive. Hope, the rescued puppy, slept close to his warm side, her breath shallow but steady. Margaret had finally dozed off in the guest bedroom. Julia listened to the faint sounds of her tossing and turning. Grief didn't let go easily. The clock on the wall ticked past 2 a.m. Julia's mind spun with questions she couldn't answer, looping over memories of David, his last words to her, the secretive way he'd acted in recent weeks, the shock of finding Hope at his funeral. The deeper she looked, the more it felt like they were just scratching the surface of something much larger. The fire popped, sending sparks dancing. Rex's ears flicked. Julia reached out, absently running her fingers over his thick fur. "We'll keep her safe," she murmured. "I promised David, even if he never asked." Outside, wind rattled the branches against the windows. The storm was mostly gone, but the darkness pressed in, heavier than ever. Every time a shadow shifted on the porch, Julia's heart skipped. She kept her phone on the table, police radio app open, volume low, just in case. Sometime after 3, the phone rang, an unfamiliar number. Julia answered on the second ring, voice low. "Hello?" There was a pause, then Margaret's shaky voice on the other end. "Julia, I can't sleep. I keep thinking, what if someone comes looking for her? For Hope? What if David was in trouble? Real trouble?" Julia's throat tightened. "I don't know yet, Margaret. But you're right. There's more going on here. I need you to be strong, okay? We have to protect Hope, whatever it takes. For David." Margaret sniffled but managed a small, determined, "Okay." Julia tried to reassure her. "Rex will watch the house. And so will I. We're safe tonight." But even as she said the words, something thumped outside, a noise by the back gate. Rex sprang to his feet, muscles taut, a warning rumble building in his chest. Julia moved quickly, grabbing the heavy flashlight from the side table and creeping toward the kitchen window. She peered out into the darkness. At first she saw nothing but the wet glimmer of the yard, the faint outline of the garden shed, and the motionless silhouettes of the neighbors' trees. Then, a flash of movement, a shadow ducking behind the fence. Julia's pulse hammered in her ears. She set the phone down, and with Rex glued to her side, crept down the hallway, checking each door and window. "Who's out there?" she whispered to the dog, knowing he understood more than most people ever would. A car drove past on the street, headlights briefly sweeping the house. For a moment, the yard was flooded with pale light, and Julia saw muddy footprints on the porch. Her heart lurched. She checked the locks again, then eased back into the living room, keeping the flashlight and her phone close at hand. The adrenaline left her shaky, but she forced herself to sit beside the fire, stroking Hope's head with a trembling hand. "Not tonight," she whispered. "You're safe tonight." The minutes crawled by. Outside, a stray cat yowled, and Julia nearly jumped out of her skin. She told herself it was just nerves, exhaustion making her see threats where there were none. But the footprints wouldn't leave her mind. Someone had been there. She considered calling the sheriff, but stopped short. What would she say? That her dead partner's K9 had found an injured puppy at his funeral, and now she was being watched? It sounded like paranoia, except Julia had learned, over years on the force, that instincts are rarely wrong. By 4 a.m., Hope woke with a soft whimper. She tried to rise but tumbled sideways, legs still too weak. Rex nudged her upright and licked her ear gently. Julia smiled, heart aching. "Good boy, Rex. Good boy, Hope." Unable to sleep, Julia made herself a mug of strong coffee and sat by the fire, lost in thought. Every so often she would check her phone, scrolling through photos of her and David and Rex on patrol, smiling, laughing, a world that seemed impossibly distant now. Tears pricked her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not yet. Just as dawn crept gray and cold across the windows, the phone buzzed again. This time, a text from Margaret. "Can you come upstairs? I just remembered something." Julia hurried up. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, face drawn but alert. "I keep thinking about the last thing David gave me. It was an old house key. He said, 'Keep this safe, Mom, in case you ever need to start over.' I thought it was sentimental, but now, what if he was trying to warn me, or lead us to something?" Julia's mind raced. "Do you still have it?" Margaret nodded, pulling the battered key from her purse. Julia took it, rolling it in her palm. It was heavy, old-fashioned, like something from a farmhouse or a storage unit. A low growl drifted up the stairs. Rex's warning again. Julia tensed. She hurried back down, heart in her throat, just as a car door slammed somewhere on the street. She peeked through the blinds, pulse racing. A moment later, the car drove away. But Julia knew, with cold certainty, that the quiet night had only been a brief reprieve. Someone was watching them, and whatever secrets David had left behind, they were growing more dangerous by the hour. She glanced at the key, then at Hope and Rex. The message was clear. The night's peace would not last. If they wanted answers or safety, they would have to chase the truth, no matter how dark the road ahead. Morning in Ashbury usually brought a sense of calm. Sunlight found its way through lace curtains, birds chirped in the maples, and the whole world seemed to exhale after another long Ohio night. But that day, as Julia Saunders stepped onto her porch, the sense of peace felt shattered. Her first hint came before she even opened the door. Rex growled, pressing his nose to the crack beneath the threshold. Julia, hair still damp from a too-short shower, peered outside and saw muddy footprints, fresh ones, tracked across her porch, leading up to the front step. Someone had been there after all, right up until dawn. She bent down, snapping a photo with her phone. Not shoe prints, but boot prints, heavy, deliberate. Margaret appeared behind her, Hope in her arms. "Did you find something?" Julia nodded grimly. Someone was here, maybe watching us. Margaret's hands tightened around the puppy. "Should we call the sheriff?" "We will, but let me look around first." Julia tried to sound brave, though her heart thudded painfully in her chest. She circled the small house, Rex glued to her hip, every sense on high alert. In the backyard, she found another set of prints, leading to the back gate. That's when she saw the note, tucked under a loose stone by the steps, wrapped in plastic to keep out the rain. Julia's fingers trembled as she unfolded the paper. The message was typed, not handwritten. "Stay quiet. Give us the dog. No cops." For a moment, Julia's mind went blank. Then a cold, familiar anger settled in. Someone wanted Hope badly enough to break into her yard, badly enough to threaten them. She folded the note and slid it into her pocket, glancing around for anything out of place. That's when she noticed Margaret's car parked at the curb, its rear window shattered, glass sparkling on the wet asphalt. Margaret gasped, seeing it too. "My car. Oh, Julia." Julia cursed softly. "They're sending a message. They want us scared." Inside, Julia dialed the sheriff, keeping her voice steady. "There's been a break-in and vandalism. I want a deputy out here ASAP." She didn't mention Hope or the note over the phone. Paranoia clawed at her, and she wasn't sure who she could trust anymore. Rex stayed by the door, hackles raised. Margaret pulled the curtains tight and sat trembling at the kitchen table, Hope pressed to her chest. "Maybe I should take her. Take Hope. To my sister in Michigan. Just until this is over." Julia shook her head. "No, that's exactly what they want. If someone's watching, you'd never make it out of town. Besides, I think this is about more than just a lost puppy." She knelt, stroking Hope's golden head. "We're not running. Not yet." It was mid-morning when a black and white cruiser pulled into the driveway. Deputy Carter, young and fresh-faced, got out and took down Julia's report. He looked at the footprints, the broken window, the note, and the nervous dog who refused to leave Hope's side. "You think this is about the dog?" Carter asked, not quite hiding his skepticism. Julia held his gaze. "I know it is. And I want a patrol on this street every hour minimum. Someone is trying to scare us." Carter nodded, eyes flicking to the nervous Margaret and the puppy. "I'll file it, but—" He hesitated. "You sure you don't want to take the dog somewhere safe? Like the shelter?" Rex let out a single, sharp bark, as if to answer for Julia. She shook her head. "No, she stays with me, until I figure this out." After the deputy left, Julia set about reinforcing her home. She double-checked every lock, slid a kitchen chair beneath the doorknob, and even dragged an old baseball bat out of her closet. The house was small, but defensible, and with Rex on guard, she felt slightly better. The rest of the day passed in a haze of tension. Julia ran only the most essential errands. Quick trip to the pharmacy, a dash into the grocery store. At every stop, she felt eyes on her. A battered gray truck followed her for 6 blocks before turning away. At the gas station, a man in a ball cap lingered at the next pump, glancing at her license plate. Julia told herself it was just nerves, but when she checked her rearview mirror, she caught Rex watching out the back window, never blinking. "You feel it too, don't you, buddy?" she murmured. At home, Margaret busied herself scrubbing dishes and sweeping, anything to keep her hands occupied. Every time a car passed, she flinched. She called her sister, debating the idea of sending Hope away, but Julia insisted they keep the family close. David wanted us to protect her. If we give up now, we lose whatever he died for. By afternoon, Julia realized she couldn't do this alone. She called Detective Julia Saunders's old friend, Captain Tom Bennett, leaving a message. "Tom, it's me. I need help. This is about David and something he left behind. Please call." As dusk fell, Julia let Rex patrol the yard, keeping Hope close. She changed her routine, turned on every light, and moved from window to window, watching for movement. For the first time, the home she'd always loved felt like a fortress under siege. That night, Margaret sat with Julia on the couch, Hope asleep between them, Rex curled protectively at their feet. "Do you think they'll come back?" Margaret whispered. Julia looked her in the eyes. "Yes, but we'll be ready." She kept the note in her pocket. The memory of the boot prints burned into her mind. She thought of David, of the secrets he'd tried to protect, and wondered just how deep the danger really went. As midnight approached, the phone buzzed again, this time with a new number and a single chilling text. "You have until sunrise." The threat felt real now. The fight, Julia realized, was only beginning. Sunrise came gray and cold, washing Julia Saunders' home in a pale, haunted light. The threatening message from the night before burned in her thoughts, a weight in her chest that even strong coffee couldn't shake. The world outside was deceptively normal. Neighbors walked their dogs, delivery trucks rumbled by, kids waited at the corner for the school bus. But inside, Julia's house felt like a pressure cooker. Margaret sat silently at the kitchen table, Hope napping in her lap. She was pale, jumpy, her nerves shot from the sleepless night and the violence that now pressed on their small family. Rex lay by the back door, eyes tracking every shadow, tail thumping only when Hope stirred. Julia pored over the details again. The muddy footprints, the vandalized car, the anonymous threats. Nothing made sense, unless Hope was more than just an abandoned puppy, unless David had died trying to keep her safe. The nagging fear that someone inside the department might be involved gnawed at her. Trust, once so easy, now felt impossible. She started her investigation the only way she knew how, by searching for answers in David's old belongings. Margaret brought out a battered cardboard box David had left at her house a week before his death. "He said not to open it until he was gone," Margaret whispered, tears in her eyes. "I thought he was being dramatic. Now I'm not so sure." Julia took the box to the dining room table and started digging. Inside were everyday things, an old badge, faded family photos, a tangle of keys and receipts. But Hope, now awake and snuffling at the edge of the box, seemed interested in something small and metallic tangled in her own collar. Julia paused, leaning in. "What have you got there, girl?" She unfastened Hope's collar, feeling a hard lump hidden in the fabric. It was a tiny, weathered USB drive, barely the size of Julia's thumbnail. Her heart skipped. Had David hidden evidence on the puppy, hoping she'd be found by the right person? Julia rushed to her laptop, plugging in the drive. Password protected. She tried David's badge number, no luck. She tried his mother's birthday, no luck. Finally, she typed in Rex's name, heart pounding. The files opened. What she found wasn't just random data. There were encrypted reports, scanned documents, and a series of video files. The folder was labeled Ashbury Case, Confidential. One document stood out, a spreadsheet tracking drug shipments, dates, and names. Another file was a memo David had written, addressed to Julia. If you're reading this, you're in danger. Trust no one, not even the department. Hope is the key. Don't let them find her. Julia's blood ran cold. She scanned through the reports, realizing David had uncovered a drug ring operating out of Ashbury, possibly with police involvement. There were names, some she recognized, others she didn't. She understood, suddenly, why he'd been so distant. He'd been trying to protect everyone he cared about, even as he hunted the truth alone. As Julia's mind raced, Rex barked sharply at the front door. Julia jumped, heart hammering, but it was only Deputy Carter again, making his scheduled rounds. She let him in, watching his body language carefully. Rex circled Carter, sniffing, hackles raised. Carter shifted on his feet, clearly uncomfortable. "Everything okay, Detective?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Julia studied him. Rex barked again, deep and hostile. "Just checking on you," Carter said, backing toward the door. Julia noticed his boots, mud still caked in the treads, the same pattern she'd seen on her porch. She felt a chill. Carter had been there last night, or close enough to leave those prints. Was he the enemy, or just scared? After he left, Julia shared the discovery with Margaret. David was onto something huge. Drugs, dirty cops, maybe more. We can't trust anyone. Margaret's fear gave way to a fierce, unexpected determination. "Whatever you need, I'll help. I won't let David's name be tarnished." Julia hugged her tightly. She'd always seen Margaret as fragile, but now she saw something else. The strength that had helped raise a good son, and now a survivor. Hope and Rex seemed to sense the shift. Rex planted himself in front of the door, refusing to move. Hope whimpered and hid beneath Julia's chair. The pressure was growing, but so was Julia's resolve. She spent the afternoon reaching out, carefully, and only to people she truly trusted. She called Captain Tom Bennett, her old mentor. When he answered, his voice was tight. "Are you in trouble, Julia?" "More than I can say on the phone. I found something. I think David was killed because of it." Tom promised to meet her that evening at a diner outside town, neutral ground. As Julia prepared to go, Margaret made sandwiches and packed water bottles, as if readying for a siege. Hope licked Margaret's hand, big brown eyes full of trust. Julia turned to Margaret. "If anything happens, take Hope and run. I'll send you a signal. Rex will go with you." Margaret nodded, chin trembling but set with determination. "I'll do whatever it takes." As the sun began to set, Julia glanced one last time at the files on the laptop. She copied them onto a spare drive, tucked it into her jacket pocket, and looked down at Rex. "Let's go get answers, partner." Rex's tail wagged once. Hope whimpered as Julia left, but she felt Margaret's eyes on her back. Strong, resolute. Whatever darkness lay ahead, they wouldn't face it alone. And with each step, Julia felt David's presence, guiding her, urging her to see the truth, no matter how dangerous. The drive to the diner on the edge of Ashbury felt like a journey into enemy territory. Julia Saunders kept her eyes glued to the rearview mirror, searching for headlights that lingered too long or cars that slowed as she turned. Rex sat in the back seat, alert and tense, nose pressed against the glass, as if he too sensed the invisible noose tightening around them. She arrived just after sunset. The diner was nearly empty, a handful of truckers hunched over coffee and pie. Julia picked a booth in the back, facing the door, the USB drive a heavy weight in her jacket pocket. Rex settled under the table, every muscle taut. Captain Tom Bennett arrived a few minutes later, wearing a battered police windbreaker and the look of a man who'd aged 10 years overnight. He slid into the booth, voice low. "You said it was about David." Julia nodded. "I found evidence he was investigating a drug ring, one that might have connections in the department. He hid the proof in a puppy's collar. Now someone's threatening us, vandalizing cars, leaving notes. I don't know who I can trust." Tom's jaw tightened. "You did the right thing calling me. There are things happening in Ashbury that go deeper than I ever imagined." He glanced at Rex, who growled softly. "Even the dog doesn't trust me, huh?" Julia managed a weak smile. "He's suspicious of everyone these days." She slid the USB drive across the table. Tom plugged it into his laptop, frowning as he scanned the files. This could bring the whole operation down," he whispered. "You realize how dangerous this is, right? If someone inside the department is involved, if they know you have this—" "I know." Julia cut him off. "That's why I need you to help me finish what David started. We have to protect Hope and Margaret, and we need to find out who's pulling the strings before they come for us." Tom nodded, tension radiating from his every move. "I'll take this to a friend at the State Bureau, someone I trust. In the meantime, keep your head down. Don't let anyone near that house you don't absolutely trust." As they spoke, Julia noticed a figure at the counter, Deputy Carter. He sipped coffee, eyes flicking to her booth. Julia felt a chill. Had he followed her? Or was it a coincidence? She nudged Tom under the table. "Don't look now, but Carter's here." Tom's eyes narrowed. "Stay calm. I'll leave first. Give me 5 minutes, then go. I'll be in touch." Julia nodded, keeping her eyes on the rain-smeared window as Tom slipped away. She waited, heart racing, then gathered Rex and hurried to the car. As she pulled out of the parking lot, she saw Carter's cruiser in her mirror. He turned on his engine and followed. Julia's mind spun with fear and anger. This was no longer just about protecting evidence. She and Margaret were targets. Hope, the puppy, was still the key. But why? What did she represent? Or what did she know that made her so dangerous to these people? She sped home, Carter's headlights close behind. When she pulled into her driveway, he parked a block away, sitting in his car, engine running. Julia locked every door and window, checking each room. Margaret was in the living room, clutching Hope, eyes wide with terror. "They're watching us again, aren't they?" Margaret whispered. Julia nodded. "Stay inside. Keep the doors locked. Don't answer for anyone but me or Tom." The tension in the house was suffocating. Rex paced restlessly, nose pressed to the door. Julia grabbed her service weapon and tucked it into her waistband, then double-checked the drive she'd copied the files onto earlier. The phone rang, an unknown number. Julia answered, holding her breath. A distorted voice crackled through the speaker. "You've crossed a line, Detective. You have something that belongs to us. Give us the puppy and no one gets hurt. This is your last warning." The line went dead. Julia's heart hammered. She felt a surge of anger. "Enough," she muttered, more to herself than anyone. She went to Margaret. "Get your coat. We're not staying here. Pack a bag for you and Hope. I'll grab Rex." Margaret nodded, her hands trembling but her resolve clear. They moved quickly, stuffing essentials into bags. Julia listened for sounds outside. Footsteps, car doors, anything. As they crept through the kitchen, a sudden crash from the back of the house made them freeze. Rex exploded into action, racing down the hallway, barking furiously. Julia drew her gun, motioning Margaret to stay back. She edged toward the sound, heart in her throat. A shadowy figure smashed the back window, reaching inside to unlatch the door, Julia fired a warning shot into the ceiling. "Get out! I'm armed and calling the police!" The intruder hesitated, then bolted into the night. Julia ran to the door, slamming it shut, locking every bolt she could. She dialed 911, voice steady but tight. "Home invasion. Suspect fled. We need patrol cars now." Within minutes, the house was flooded with blue and red lights, officers swarming the yard. Carter arrived, face blank. He took her statement, but his eyes never met hers. Julia kept her story simple, but inside, she was done trusting anyone in uniform. By midnight, the house was quiet again. Julia sat with Margaret and Hope by the fire. Rex stretched across the doorway, an impenetrable barrier. Margaret's voice was shaky but determined. "I'm not leaving. I won't let them win." Julia squeezed her hand. "Then we do this together. We finish what David started. We bring them down." Rex looked up at her, his eyes filled with the same fierce loyalty. Julia felt her fear harden into resolve. They would not be intimidated. Not tonight. Not ever again. And as another storm rolled over Ashbury, the little family steeled themselves for whatever darkness the dawn might bring. By the time morning sunlight crept across Julia Saunders's living room, the siege on her home had ended. The police cars had vanished, the smashed glass was swept away, and the adrenaline that had fueled Julia through the night ebbed into a bruised, exhausted calm. Rex, still vigilant, lay at the threshold, his eyes tracking every movement in the yard. Hope nestled between Margaret and Julia on the couch, twitching in puppy dreams, blissfully unaware of how close danger had come. Margaret sipped her coffee, hands trembling, her resolve forged in the crucible of fear. "I never thought I'd be brave enough to face down a criminal," she murmured. "But when you love someone, or something, sometimes there's just no choice." Julia smiled, worn out but proud. "That's real loyalty, Margaret. You didn't run even when it got dangerous. David would have been proud. And so would Hope." The hours crawled by. Julia contacted Captain Tom Bennett and told him about the night's events. He promised state police backup and confirmed that evidence from David's USB drive had been delivered to the right hands. "It's not over," Tom said, voice heavy with fatigue. "But the end is in sight. Stay strong, Julia." As news of the attempted break-in spread, neighbors dropped off casseroles, and home-cooked meals, their way of saying, "We've got your back." For the first time since David's funeral, Julia felt the warmth of community pressing in, pushing back the chill of fear. Yet, in the quiet moments, Julia was haunted by the bigger questions. Had she done enough? What if she'd failed David? She watched Rex, loyal to the core, and thought of all the ways he'd shown up, at the funeral, at the door, in the dead of night, never wavering. Margaret noticed Julia's brooding and squeezed her hand. "You can't save everyone, but you can honor those you've lost, by fighting for the living." That afternoon, Julia sat at her kitchen table, pen in hand, writing a letter addressed to Margaret and the police department. She poured out everything, the pain, the fear, the love, the lessons learned in the crucible of loss. She wrote about loyalty, not as blind obedience, but as an everyday choice, 1,000 small acts that add up to something powerful. She wrote about doubt and how grief could blind you not just to loss, but to the possibility of new beginnings. She described the moment at the funeral when Rex refused to let go, when he had clawed at the casket, unwilling to leave hope behind. That moment, Julia realized, was the purest form of loyalty. "Sometimes," she wrote, "animals see the truth we miss, even in our own pain." Margaret read the letter that night by the fire. Tears slipped down her cheeks. But for the first time since David's death, she allowed herself to truly mourn. It wasn't just about losing her son anymore. It was about the chance to begin again, to let hope in, to build something new. Caring for Hope had reawakened a part of her heart she thought was lost forever. As dusk fell, Margaret found Julia in the backyard. "Do you remember that old house key David gave me?" Margaret asked softly. "I think I know where it fits. His old locker at the station. He always said, 'If anything happens to me, you'll know what to do.' I thought he was being overdramatic, but now—" She trailed off, hope glimmering in her eyes. Julia's pulse quickened. "We'll go tomorrow. Together." They spent that night as a family, Julia, Margaret, Rex, and Hope, reclaiming something fragile but unbreakable: trust. Julia realized that Rex, by refusing to let go, had shown them that true loyalty means standing guard, even when everyone else turns away. Later, after Margaret had gone to bed, Julia sat alone with Rex at her feet, the fire throwing gold shadows across the floor. She let her mind wander, analyzing everything they'd endured: the doubts, the dangers, the moments of pure courage. Rex looked up at her, big brown eyes full of a devotion she felt deep in her bones. "We're almost there, boy," she whispered. "We'll finish what David started." As the house grew quiet, Julia reflected on what she would tell anyone listening: that real loyalty is resilient. It's what endures, not just in presence, but in the willingness to protect, nurture, and help others through their darkest hours. That healing only comes when you open yourself to new relationships and trust, even after heartbreak. Margaret, reading Julia's words again the next morning, realized she no longer felt trapped by her grief. She felt it, yes, but also a stirring of something new. She looked at Hope, now stronger and bolder, and understood that David's legacy wasn't just his service or his sacrifice. It was the bonds and compassion he left behind, the community that rallied, the quiet courage that changed everything. By sunrise, Julia knew the end was near, but she also knew the story had become something greater than just a police case or a personal tragedy. It was about the unbreakable bonds that survive even the hardest trials, and the loyalty that refuses to let go. Ashbury's air carried the gentle promise of spring as Julia Saunders and Margaret prepared for what they hoped would be their final journey into the past. Sunlight filtered through the trees, painting gold across the sidewalks, and neighbors waved from their yards, sensing a change in the atmosphere. It wasn't just the new season. It was the sense that the darkness over their little town was finally lifting. Margaret clutched the old house key David had given her, its brass worn smooth by years of anxious handling. She and Julia hadn't slept much, but there was a quiet determination in both women as they climbed into Julia's car, Rex and Hope riding along. Rex stuck his head out the window, sniffing the air, every sense alive. Hope, now stronger and more confident, perched proudly beside him, her tail thumping against the seat. As they drove to the police station, Julia replayed the letter she had written in her mind. How it felt to put grief and gratitude into words. How strange it was to realize that pain and hope could exist side by side. She thought of David, not just as a partner or a hero, but as a brother, a friend, a man who loved fiercely and lived by his own code. That code had saved lives. It had built a family. They arrived at the old brick building just after sunrise, slipping in through the side door before the morning rush. Julia's badge still opened every lock, but it was Margaret's hand that trembled as she slid the key into the battered locker at the end of the hall. The lock clicked open. Inside, among old uniforms and boxes of case files, was a slim manila folder marked simply, "For Julia." Tucked beside it was David's service revolver, the handle worn and smooth, and a small velvet pouch holding his father's police medal. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she held the medal, a tangible piece of the family's legacy. Julia opened the folder and found a letter in David's handwriting, shakier than usual but unmistakably his. "Jules, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it out. I'm sorry for what I had to put you and Mom through, but I know you. You never let go. You never backed down. I hope you found hope. She's more than just a puppy. She's evidence, a witness, and a friend. Protect her and protect each other. I dug into something too big for me alone. The files I left in her collar should be enough to bring them down. Trust only Bennett. If he's gone too, go to the state police. Don't try to play hero. Let the truth come out, and then let yourselves heal. I never said it enough, but I love you both. Take care of Rex for me, and if you can, start over. Don't let my mistakes keep you from living." Julia wiped away tears that wouldn't stop coming, clutching the letter to her heart. Margaret hugged her, the two women joined by loss and newfound hope. "He always worried he'd leave us alone," Margaret said quietly. But he didn't. Not really. The next days unfolded like scenes from a long-awaited spring. Captain Bennett, true to his word, worked with the state police and federal agents, using the files David had hidden and the evidence Hope had carried. The Ashbury drug ring was exposed, and the ringleaders, including the corrupt officers, were arrested. The case shocked the whole town, but most people felt relief rather than betrayal. They'd known deep down that something had been wrong, and now the rot was cut away. At the small ceremony that followed, the town gathered in the square to honor David's sacrifice. Julia, Margaret, Rex, and Hope stood together, no longer just a detective, a grieving mother, and two dogs, but a new kind of family forged in fire. The mayor presented Margaret with a plaque and medal, her hands shaking with pride and sorrow. Julia gave a short speech, her voice steady despite the weight of emotion. David Miller wasn't just a good cop. He was a good man. He believed in justice, but even more in kindness. He taught me and all of us that sometimes heroism is quiet. It's found in small acts. A hand offered, a secret kept, a promise not broken. We honor him not by remembering his death, but by living the way he showed us. Brave, loyal, and full of hope. The town applauded, but the real tribute was unspoken. In the way neighbors helped each other, in the way Margaret hugged Hope and smiled through tears, in the way Rex, proud, scarred, and vigilant, was awarded a special medal for his devotion. Hope, once a fragile bundle of fear, now ran circles around the town's children, barking with joy. Julia saw herself in the puppy's journey, from lost and afraid to bold and beloved. The scars were still there, but they were part of the story, not the end of it. As the ceremony ended, Julia looked out over the crowd and realized that David's legacy was more than cases solved or criminals caught. His legacy was the resilience of his family, the courage of his friends, and the unbreakable web of kindness he'd woven through his community. She knew with absolute certainty that loss was not the end. It was an invitation, a call to build, to love, to begin again. In the weeks that followed, life in Ashbury slowly returned to normal. But for Julia, Margaret, Rex, and Hope, normal would never mean the same thing. They were a family now, shaped by grief but held together by loyalty and love. Every morning, Julia walked the dogs with Margaret, and every evening, they sat together and watched the sun set, grateful for the peace they had fought so hard to win. And always, as dusk fell, Rex would settle at Julia's feet. Hope curled at his side, a living reminder that the greatest legacy is not what we leave behind, but what we give, every day, to those we love. Spring in Ashbury arrived soft and green, carrying the scent of new grass and damp earth. It was the kind of season that made even old wounds ache a little less, the kind that invited people out of their houses and into the sun. On a Saturday morning not long after the ceremony, the town gathered in Ashbury Park for something simple and extraordinary: a tree planting in David Miller's memory. Julia Saunders stood at the edge of the park, hands deep in her jacket pockets, watching Margaret and Hope play in the grass. Rex trotted close by, tongue out, nudging children and accepting gentle pats. People she barely knew stopped to thank her, to ask about the case, to offer a casserole or just a handshake. There was a warmth to it, a sense of community Julia realized she'd missed in all her years of chasing justice and carrying secrets. A small maple tree, just over 6 feet tall, waited in a hole near the playground. Its roots were wrapped in burlap, ready to unfurl and reach deep into Ashbury's soil. The mayor handed Julia a shovel, and for a moment, she just stared at it, overwhelmed by the memory of David as a rookie, digging holes for fence posts at his mother's farm, all eager grins and scraped knuckles. Margaret, standing beside her, smiled through tears. He'd have loved this, you know. Something that keeps growing, long after we're gone. Neighbors joined in, each tossing a bit of earth onto the roots. Children pressed pennies and lucky stones into the soil, their laughter floating on the breeze. Julia felt her chest tighten, but it wasn't just grief. It was gratitude. For David, for Margaret, for Rex and Hope, and for the whole town that had come together when it mattered. When the tree was settled and watered, the mayor asked Julia if she'd say a few words. The crowd hushed, expectant. Julia stepped forward, feeling Rex press against her leg and Margaret squeeze her shoulder. She cleared her throat and looked out over the faces, some tearful, some smiling, all connected by what they'd endured. This story isn't just mine, or David's, or Margaret's. It belongs to all of us, she began. It's the story of what happens when we choose to stand by each other, even when it's hard, even when we're scared. Sometimes loyalty means running toward danger. Sometimes it means holding on through the storm. Sometimes it means letting yourself start over, even after loss. She glanced down at Rex, then at Hope, now playing with a group of children beneath the tree's tender shade. If you've ever found comfort or hope in a loyal friend, whether they walk on 2 legs or 4, I invite you to share that story. Reach out to someone who needs it, because sometimes the smallest act of empathy or a single loyal friend can heal wounds we thought would never close. A quiet settled over the crowd, a hush filled with meaning. Julia felt her heart open, the pain of David's loss woven now with something lighter, a sense that his story would live on, not just in memory, but in the actions and kindnesses of the people he loved. As the gathering broke up, neighbors lingered, telling stories, trading hugs, sharing memories of David. Margaret hugged Julia tightly, whispering, "Thank you for bringing him home, for bringing us all back." The days that followed were quieter, but not empty. Margaret adopted Hope officially, her name stitched on a new collar, Hope Miller. Rex, recognized as a hero by the entire town, seemed finally to let himself relax, sprawling in the sun while hope tumbled over him, a living symbol of new beginnings. Julia continued her work with the department, but now she made space for more than just duty. She stopped to talk to her neighbors. She joined Margaret and the dogs for long walks through Ashbury's winding streets. Sometimes, they'd pass the maple tree in the park, its leaves trembling with the promise of future shade. And Julia would remember David not for how he'd died, but for how fiercely he'd loved, and how deeply he'd been loved in return. On quiet evenings, Julia wrote in her journal, letters to David she knew he'd never read. She wrote about mistakes and forgiveness, and how some wounds never close. But you learn to carry them, and to let others help carry them too. She wrote about Rex, about hope, about Margaret's courage and her own doubts. Most of all, she wrote about loyalty, not as blind devotion, but as a daily, stubborn act of faith. On the anniversary of David's death, the family, Julia, Margaret, Rex, and Hope, invited neighbors and friends to a picnic beneath the maple tree. People brought photos, favorite stories, even old dog toys for Rex and Hope. Julia listened to them all, the laughter and the tears, and felt something settle in her chest. A sense of belonging, the kind David had always found so easily, and she had always chased. As twilight settled, Julia rose and spoke one last time. If this story has touched you, share it with someone who needs hope. Sometimes the smallest acts, a kind word, a shared memory, a helping hand, can begin to heal a whole community. We all have losses. We all have scars. But together, we can grow something beautiful, just like this tree. And maybe that's the best legacy of all. She knelt to hug Rex and Hope, their fur warm and soft beneath her hands. Children played nearby, their laughter ringing through the Ohio dusk. The maple tree stood tall against the sky, its branches reaching upward year by year, just as Julia, Margaret, Rex, and Hope would keep reaching, toward each other, toward healing, and toward whatever came next. Because in the end, the real story was not about tragedy, but about the hope and loyalty that remain, quietly, stubbornly, through every storm.